A new report from the Australia Institute shows that over $10 billion in government subsidies were given to coal, oil and gas companies and other major users of fossil fuels in the last financial year. One Commonwealth tax break of nearly $8 billion exceeded the money spent on the Australian Army in the same period. Rod Campbell is Research Director at the Australia Institute and he joins me now. Rod, thank you. And this is timely. We've had Joe Biden commit to ending fossil fuel subsidies. Before we get into what each of these subsidies were, what prompted this report?
So the issue of fossil fuel subsidies pushing climate action in the wrong direction, or pushing fossil fuel use in the wrong direction rather than the phase out that should be occurring, that's been of concern to economists and climate campaigners for quite some time. The Australia Institute has published research for quite a number of years on these sorts of assistance measures that come from the federal governments and the state governments, but we haven't done a comprehensive overview of how much all governments were providing to fossil fuel industries for quite a number of years. And so we thought it was time to look at it again, and we were pretty shocked that we'd gone over the $10 billion mark in 2020-21.
Yeah, comprehensive, all right. It's 70 pages. So who or what is getting the money?
So as you've mentioned, the biggest cost to Australian taxpayers in relation to fossil fuels is the tax break that allows major fossil fuel users to get a rebate on fuel tax. And a large amount of that money accrues to the coal industry itself. The coal industry is a major user of diesel as well as a major producer of, funnily enough, coal. And so that tax break works to not just make diesel cheaper for coal miners to use, but it makes coal cheaper to produce, to send overseas and burn. Mm-hmm. So that's a particular concern. But there's a wide range of measures, such as investment in coal railways, subsidising gas and coal exploration, and a lot of money going into carbon capture and storage. Mm-hmm. There's a wide range of ways that Australian governments assist the fossil fuel sector. And, aside from being a climate issue, this is redirecting money from other government priorities like health and education, and most of the money ending up with multinational mining corporations.
And Rod, is this federal or state money?
Both. So federal money accounts for around $8 billion and the states much of the other $2 billion. But over the longer term, state governments have also committed to measures worth around $8 billion. So a bit of both is what we're seeing. And some of the more surprising ones come from governments that you might not expect. The Northern Territory government is one of the biggest subsidisers of the gas industry in the country, principally through its commitment to buy $4 billion worth of gas, much more than it knew it needed. Or it knew it didn't need that much gas. Mm-hmm. And once you've bought more gas than you need, suddenly you need a pipeline to help sell that gas, and the NT taxpayer is on the hook for another $1 billion to help transport gas around the territory, much of which it never needed in the first place. So within our report, there's all kinds of examples of different ways that governments are propping up the coal, oil and gas sectors.
Can these subsidies continue if the PM commits to zero net emissions by 2050?
No, they can't. And we're seeing governments and other players around the world call for these kinds of measures to be phased out. The Biden government has explicitly said that they're working to phase out fossil fuel subsidies from their budget. And we've seen out today the UN Secretary General highlighting the need to reform fossil fuel subsidies around the world. There's been a group of governments with the somewhat awkward name of the Association for Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform, including New Zealand and Switzerland and Sweden. this has been an issue that many governments have been looking at for quite a long time, and now some of the big players like the US are really getting serious about it, and it's time Australia did too.
And yet, despite in this context, you say, and you make the point in the report, that years ago these subsidies would have been announced quietly, now they're central government policy. So what has changed?
Yeah, I think the word subsidy became a bad word over the last couple of decades, where pretty market rationalist governments decided that subsidies were a bad thing, and so they needed to be taken away. And originally, the very idea that fossil fuel industries received subsidies used to be contested by the industry because that was seen as a bad thing. But I think we've seen huge arguments over whether or not taxpayers should be funding the Adani mine, and now we're seeing a explicitly government policy of a gas-fired recovery, including $170 million to build the roads that the gas industry wants to use in the Northern Territory. This used to be sort of a secret, or a sort of an academic exercise in the back of budget papers, but now public support for the gas and coal industry now seems to be very open Australian government policy. Which I guess it means at least we're talking about it. Hopefully that makes it easier to reform.
Well, the full report from the Australia Institute. Rod Campbell, the research director there, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Gemma.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.